Hey everyone, it's Samuel, and welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Today in the Prime Material, using the upper planes in your stories, Part 2. In the wilds, the angelic deva. And in the tavern, what would you do if you can't planeshift away? Hey everyone, I hope everybody out there is staying safe and well. We're excited to have you back for another episode of Plot Hooks. Today we're going to be continuing our series that we started way back in episode 2 when Matt and I discussed using the upper planes in our collaborative stories, and we're going to be continuing that series today. Before we get into it, just a couple of announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You can find us on all of those platforms. You can subscribe to the podcast on YouTube if you'd like. And we would also appreciate as you listen to the podcast in the various apps and websites and other places where you can find the podcast. We'd appreciate it if you would give us a good rating. It helps us spread the word about the podcast to more and more people. Finally, it'd be awesome of you if you could support us on Patreon. There's lots of awesome perks up there for our patrons, including, of course, the homebrew information for our setting of Erick. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be releasing the new race, which is part of this setting, up there on our Patreon. But whether you come for that or just to support the podcast, it would be very much appreciated. That support helps us make the podcast even better for you each and every day. All right, with that out of the way, using the upper planes in our stories. Again, this is part 2 of our series. If you're interested in hearing that first discussion, as I mentioned, that's episode 2. And the reason we wanted to explore this concept is because it's rather easy to use the lower planes in D&D's cosmology in a story. Those planes are inherently evil, and it's quite easy to have a quest or a villain residing in one of those places, such as the Nine Hells or the Abyss. But what story elements can we weave into our collaborative narratives in order to utilize the upper planes, those good-aligned planes in the Dungeons & Dragons multiverse? Well, in our first episode, we discussed this concept in a general sense, and then we zoomed in on the neutral good plane of Elysium and the plane of Bitopia, which rests on the line between neutral good and lawful good. Today, we'll review our past discussion a little bit, and then we'll zoom in on the planes of Arcadia and Ysgard. First, by way of review, let's refresh our memory on what we mean by these D&D cosmological terms. It all starts in the prime material plane, which is where the majority of your adventures and storytelling will take place. It's the world that you think of when you think of a particular setting that you happen to be in, such as the Forgotten Realms. The prime material is then surrounded by all the other planes, and that location of the prime material, that prime world is where all the elements and matter and ideologies and philosophies of the entire rest of the multiverse crash together and create the craziness that we know of as life within a particular setting. This primary existence of the prime material then has 2 reflections. There's an echo of gray and despair, known as the Shadowfell, and there's a wondrous and tricky and dangerous echo known as the Feywild. Further out from that, enveloping the prime material and its reflections, there's what's known as the inner planes. Primarily, when we think of these, we think of the 4 elemental planes, the plane of air, water, fire, and earth. And all of the matter which makes up the prime material plane, all of that physical stuff, are from these concentrations of elemental essence. Even further beyond that, there's what's known as, unsurprisingly, the outer planes. And whereas the inner elemental planes provide the matter for the rest of the multiverse, the outer planes are sort of where the various ideologies and philosophies and thoughts in the cosmos find their purchase. The gods primarily reside on these planes, and these are where many mortals go when they die. And each one of these 16 outer planes corresponds to an alignment on D&D's alignment chart. And those outer planes aligned in some way with evil are called the lower planes, and those that are aligned in some way with good are the ones we're concerned with today, the upper planes. Now, as we mentioned back in episode 2, all of this is much more detailed. Didn't even talk about the astral plane or the ethereal plane or a lot more. And of course, there's some variance based on your setting as well. But this gives us an idea of what we mean when we say upper planes. They are the outer planes defined by some sort of good alignment. There's 7 of these planes altogether. There's Arcadia, Mount Celestia, Bitopia, Elysium, the Beastlands, Arborea, and Ysgard. Also, last time we discussed this topic, we talked a little bit about potential ways you could use the upper planes in general in your story. You can use it as a place of respite between your adventures. You could also use them where there's a specific item that the party has to get from a particular location, such as getting an object from Mount Celestia in order to defeat a particular foe. And of course, if you want to hear our discussion about that a little bit more, go back and listen to episode 2. Today, though, we're going to dive straight in and talk specifically about these 2 planes, Arcadia and Ysgard, which are on the border of the good spectrum. Arcadia is at the intersection of lawful good and lawful neutral, and Ysgard is at the border between chaotic good and chaotic neutral. And so these planes are a little bit unique in terms of the upper planes because they're defined more by law and chaos respectively than they are by good. But they are definitely good shades of the lawful and chaotic concepts. First, let's talk about Arcadia. The peaceable kingdoms of Arcadia are aligned, as we mentioned, between lawful good and lawful neutral. This is a plane where everything is pure and works to the common good of all who reside in the realm. It is harmonious, it is ordered, and it is unblemished. It's a wonderful place to be. It's characterized by good, thriving order. There's perfect fields and straight streams. The mountains are beautiful and have no erosion. The gardens and orchards have perfectly straight lines of plants. The roadways are immaculate, and even the towns and cities themselves are arranged in an orderly, pleasing geometric pattern. The night and day cycles are exactly equal as well, 12 hours of each, and it's the same no matter where you are on the plane. It's controlled by a giant orb in the sky that has moonlight on one side and light on the other, and it slowly spins throughout the 24-hour day, bringing about the orderly day cycle. Interestingly, the weather in the plane is also controlled by 4 allied demigods, which are called Storm Kings. The 4 of them are the Wind Queen, the Cloud King, the Rain Queen, and the Lightning King. Each of them have a castle amidst the bliss of the plane, oriented on the 4 compass points surrounding the orb of night and day. And each castle is surrounded by the weather which that particular demigod controls. But they all work together according to precise planning in order to assure that each inch of the plane gets the perfect balance of weather. So with all that being said, I think the best way to describe Arcadia is that it's essentially a blissful place of balance, harmony, and order. You can see the law, you can see the order just through the entire fabric of how the plane works, but it is inherently good and beautiful and pleasing. Interestingly, the Dungeon Master's Guide states that underneath the mountains of Arcadia, there are several ancient kingdoms of dwarves which dwell here in this space. I'm honestly Not really sure why. The chief dwarven deity Moradin is lawful good, but his domain is on the 4th layer of Mount Celestia, not on Arcadia. So I'm not sure exactly why dwarves specifically dwell amidst the mountains of this plane, but they do. Older editions do describe multiple layers of Arcadia, but as with most other planes, 5th edition does not specify any number of layers. The 3rd edition manual of the planes describes 2 layers for Arcadia and a 3rd which used to exist but was absorbed into Mechanus. Now, there really isn't much difference between the layers, except for the fact that the 2nd layer has a little bit more of a militant aspect. It sort of became a mustering ground for the forces of Arcadia as they prepared to make an ideological thrust to reclaim the 3rd layer that had been lost from Mechanus. But again, as with most planes in the Dungeon Master's Guide, the different layers are not generally described when it comes to the outer planes unless it's actually relevant to the core of what makes the plane important, such as with the 9 hells or the infinite layers of the abyss. We'll have to wait until a manual of the planes comes out for 5th edition in order to get any canonized description on any of the specific layers. But what about using Arcadia in your story? That's a little bit about what the plane is about, but what about using it? Well, the first thing that I can think of is going back to what I said last week in the Tavern segment. When you're thinking about plot hooks, one way to come up with them and one way to figure out what you can use in your story is building out the surrounding area and thinking about what could go wrong. And here in Arcadia, this world is such a perfect, blissful world of order. I think it would be fascinating to come up with a scenario where disorder has somehow come into this orderly place. Perhaps an invasion of some kind into this place, maybe from the forces of a rival deity to a god who lives somewhere on this plane. Perhaps from the chaotic forces of the abyss or a devilish incursion. Or maybe it's not so overt, the plot hook that actually draws your party into this plane. Maybe it's a mystery as to what actually is going on. Maybe a deity that the cleric serves or another party member in your particular adventuring group has ties to Arcadia, either themselves dwelling in that space or perhaps a deity that they're close with dwells in that space, and they summon the party there to Arcadia in order to investigate exactly what's going on. And you can have this whole arc where you're trying to figure out why disorder is coming to this orderly place, and then you're trying to stop it. I also love the idea of the Storm Kings. That's a great visual. Having these 4 entities which are aligned on the compass points, which each control different aspects of the weather, and they interact together in order to create the perfect balance of weather over every inch of the plane. But around their castle, there's just the specific type of weather that they control. It's just an excellent visual, and I think they'd be really interesting characters to interact with. Perhaps there's a quest that you can send your party on where they need approval from all 4 of these Storm Kings. Perhaps there's something in the material plane that's going wrong with regards to the weather. Perhaps that's part of a greater arc in your storyline where there's something that's going wrong. And your druid that has their control weather type spells is having trouble affecting it, and they need to figure out how to do something a little bit more powerful. And maybe they have to go to Arcadia in order to interact and get blessings from each one of these Storm Kings. There's also a random detail that 3rd edition throws in about Arcadia with regards to the orchards which are surrounding the plains. And that is that the fruit of these trees, while it's not magical while it's on the plants, when it's picked, the fruit gets a magical effect. the fruit is granted the effect of a random potion whenever it's picked. And I think that is a cool little tidbit to throw in, because anytime you drop your party in the middle of an orchard or a field, they usually ask what the fruit is. They usually ask if they can pick some. And it's a cool little tidbit that you can throw in that is just a little bit of a unique and creative difference. You can limit it a little bit so that they don't just pick 1,000 fruits and have 1,000 different potions. But perhaps after the fact, perhaps after they leave the plane and they still have one of these fruits, they all of a sudden just discover, whenever the wizard casts Detect Magic in the middle of a dungeon, that, oh, there's this little glowing thing in my backpack, and now this fruit has a magical property, and they get to figure out what it is. A cool little tidbit to use potentially in a story. There's also this whole idea of Mechanus absorbing the lowest layer of the plane. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of multiple layers in most planes. Again, as we discussed when we're talking about planes that's built into it, like the 7 layers of Mount Celestia and the infinite layers of the Abyss and the 4 layers of Acheron. There's some planes where that's built into the fabric of what makes the plane what it is. But when it comes to a plane like Arcadia, I'm perfectly content just having it be one infinite layer. But if you do want to use this idea of Mechanus absorbing a layer of the plane, then go ahead and do that. That's a really interesting concept where you have the lawful neutral plane, which is adjacent to this lawful neutral, lawful good plane of Arcadia, beginning to encroach on Arcadia's space. And you can even do this if it's just one layer of Arcadia, maybe just one part of the plane next to a portal to Mechanus is now becoming more and more lawful neutral and less lawful neutral, lawful good, and things like modrons and gears and different things which makes Mechanus what it is are beginning to pop up all over this region of the plane. And that could be a really interesting story element. It's a affront to the order of the plane, as we discussed before, but it's not necessarily an evil encroachment. It's just the force of pure law, the force of pure order is infiltrating this space. You can have it be nefarious. You can use the mysterious figure of Primus, the godlike entity that created the Modrons and dwells on Mechanus. You can have him be some sort of big villain in your campaign arc, but just this idea of Mechanus encroaching on the space of Arcadia can create some interesting opportunities for storytelling. The second plane we wanted to discuss today was Ysgard. The heroic domains of Ysgard is situated at the intersection of chaotic neutral and chaotic good. And as we mentioned before, it has more of a chaotic element to it than a good element, but it is a noble place nonetheless. And in this case, it's the domain of heroic battle. It's the place where valor is shown and glory is achieved. In fact, when those spending their afterlife in this plane die, they rise again the next morning to continue to partake in the glory of battle. As far as the topography of the plane is concerned, it's a very mountainous realm. There's lots of tall peaks, huge canyons, deep fjords, and of course, battlefields. There are massive creatures that travel the surface as well, such as dragons and giants. And all the land masses are actually afloat on enormous seas of volcanic rock. But if you trudge deep enough through into the interior of the plane, you actually reach an ice layer. And in this ice layer, there are massive caves that hold entire kingdoms of all sorts of beings, from humanoids like gnomes, dwarves, and humans, to giants. Overall, it's quite a formidable plane, but it's one that's marked by heroism. and those seeking to demonstrate their valor will occasionally travel to this plane in order to test themselves against the trials of the realm's hardships itself, and also against that of the many ferocious creatures that litter the plane. If some of this sounds familiar to you, that's because a lot of this plane's influence comes from Norse mythology. In Norse mythology, there are 9 worlds, and you'll recognize the fire element of this plane of Ysgard being representative of the fire realm Muspelheim. There's also the ice element, which is sort of like Helheim, but that's also the Norse realm of the dead, so it's not exactly the same apart from the fact that it's icy. Giants are also prevalent here on Ysgard as they are in Norse mythology, where one of the 9 worlds is the entire realm of the giants called Jotunheim. And in fact, in older editions, where we again go back to multiple layers of the planes, the second layer of the plane was actually called Muspelheim. And there was even an elven location in the top layer of the plane called Elfheim, which is one of the 9 worlds in Norse mythology, and an area in the third layer of the plane called Svartalheim, which is the realm of the dwarves in Norse mythology, and also where dwarves lived in this particular realm in Dungeons & Dragons. In fact, if your setting happens to take the Norse pantheon set of deities, many of them could reside here in this plane's various locales. So it is something that is very heavily influenced by Norse mythology. As far as ways to use Ysgard, I love the idea of a quest being to talk to the soul of a fallen hero. This is the plane of heroism. This is where people who have loved the thrill of battle and fighting for good and fighting for justice go to do that for eternity, to show their valor for eternity. And perhaps if there's some sort of lost knowledge that the party needs to find in order to defeat a villain, then they can go to this location, they can go to Ysgard and seek out this particular person. Perhaps if you're in a campaign where a war is ongoing in the prime material, maybe they're seeking an individual who was allied with them who passed away earlier in the campaign. You know, it doesn't have to be some long-lost fallen hero. It could be something that is much more recent. And they go here to Ysgard in order to actually track them down and get the information they need. This plane also gives a real opportunity for a great variety of combat. There's real threats here, and there's lots of opportunities for the party to fight dragons and giants and lots of things such as that. But there's also a lot of chances for prove your mettle combat where they come across a particular hero from long lost lore. And in order to get the information that they need, maybe the only way to attain it is to defeat the person who has that information in a duel. And it gives a great opportunity for safe combat where your party just gets to prove their worth, or perhaps an individual member of your party gets to prove their worth. Or even you can set up a scenario where each member of the party needs to find a different person in this particular realm, and each one of them has to have this sort of individual duel. There's also great visual opportunity here. The whole idea of the landmass is essentially floating around on molten rock gives a really interesting visual to me. You know, most of the time, you're going to be on land masses that are so big, so massive, you're not ever going to see the molten rock, at least by my understanding. But whenever you come to the edge of one of these places, getting to the next can provide a really interesting challenge. You can have a chasm leading down to this fiery element below you, or you can have the particular floating continents coming into contact with each other and creating some tectonic plate activity, but magnified, where these two plates are just crashing into each other. And the visual of your party standing on a massive cliff, looking down at lava below, next to fjords and massive canyons, as another one of these plates comes hurtling towards them is a really interesting visual and can create a great skill challenge, which you can tell really interesting stories with. But I think that will wrap up Ysgard and Arcadia. I think it's time to go to the wilds. Back out here in the wilds, and today we're going to talk about a being that you might encounter amidst your travels on the upper planes, the deva. The deva is an angel, and I was going to do all the angels today, since that's the being that you typically think of when you're talking about the good aligned planes, especially ones like Arcadia, which have elements of lawful good. But when I looked at it, the subject is just too broad for this segment, so we'll have to split up the different angels into different segments. All angels, though, are what the Monster Manual, where they can be found on page 15, calls shards of the divine. They're essentially made by good deities out of their own essence, creating stunningly beautiful beings of pure good and law that are devoted to following their deity's will. They're dedicated wholeheartedly to the purpose that's set before it. Now, devas are the angels that you're most likely to encounter, and that's not just because they're the most common, but that's also because they're the messengers of the gods they serve as it relates to the prime material and its reflections, the Shadowfell and the Feywild, and they will travel to those places in order to take messages. And they actually have the ability to take various forms as they travel in order to blend in and complete their task. Sitting at a challenge rating 10, the deva has certain things about its stat block which are common to all other angelic beings. They have the angelic weapons feature, which makes it deal an extra 48 radiant damage anytime it hits with any sort of weapon. It also has innate spellcasting using its charisma modifier. It's got magic resistance. It's got a healing touch. All of these are things which are standard among D&D angels in 5th edition. One thing about the deva which sets it apart from things like the planetar and the solar is that they do not have the feature that more powerful angels have in that they can detect lies. Planetars and solars both have the feature called divine awareness, where they automatically sense it anytime they hear a lie. Devas do not have that. So if you're interested in throwing an angel at a party without actually having that particular feature, the deva actually does not have that built into its stat block. But more so than any particular stat block element about the deva, I think the thing which is most interesting about using them and other angels for that matter in a story is the whole idea of the fact that they are beings of pure goodness and law which can have unintended consequences. The Monster Manual spells this out in pretty great detail. Angels rarely are incorrect in their thinking, in their judgments. But this can lead them to be prideful at times. And in fact, they can refuse to listen to another being if it has a different idea than their own. This pride can cause them to think that they're infallible, that they can't make mistakes. And this false sense can cause them to actually fall by committing an evil act, whether on purpose or accidentally. And this attitude is great for creating conflict with a party. Just because the party is trying to accomplish a good goal does not mean that a deva is necessarily going to agree with the way that they're going about it. It can be an interesting way to pull at the gray areas of your story if you're particularly interested in exploring a campaign that has a high focus on morality. A conflict with an angel will really bring that to the fore. The shape-shifting elements of the deva can also be very interesting. it can magically morph itself into a humanoid or a beast that has a challenge rating less than its own, or less than 10. Having a particular NPC being an angel in disguise can be a really interesting option, especially when it comes to campaigns that have to do with difficult moral decisions. And the deva can even disguise itself as animals, or many other things which the party might encounter. You can have this magical fox which is tagged along with the party throughout a particular quest, which has the ability to actually heal whenever it touches somebody. You can have them go through a particular arc with this fox helping them while they're trying to figure out what it is until they eventually figure out that it's a deva. Sort of like a lawful good version of Garmelie, if you're familiar with that particular being from Season 1 of Critical Role and his experience with the party as they traveled through the Feywild. You can also work the story of a fallen angel pretty easily into your narrative. The Monster Manual, again, outlines this in pretty great detail, because they actually still keep the power that they have, even after they fall. They just lose the connection they have with the deity that is in charge of them. There's some angels that after they fall, they essentially turn evil and try to get back at the god which banished them. But then there's many that just take it in stride and go to the prime material plane and just live in disguise somewhere. They sort of pull a Ben Kenobi and just live in isolation, and no one knows how important they are or what they did or how powerful they are. They're just living in the middle of nowhere. And the Monster Manual even mentions, and I'll read this portion word for word, it says, if they are redeemed, they can become powerful allies dedicated to justice and compassionate service. So this can be just a nugget that you throw in the middle of your campaign, where there's this quirky NPC that lives out in the middle of the woods that you know as a dungeon master is just an angel in disguise, an angel who's fallen and is just kind of living out this hermit lifestyle. And if the party doesn't ever seek to follow up on that lead, then so be it, they'll never know. But if they do seek to follow up on that lead, they can actually gain a powerful ally to help them in their quest to defeat whatever the villain they're going after, or to accomplish whatever goal they happen to be trying to achieve. So overall, I think devas provide a really deep well of opportunities for storytelling than there might be at first glance. But I think I've just about had enough of the wilderness. Let's head back to the tavern and get some refreshment. All right, back here in the friendly confines of the tavern. The plot hook today: what would you do if you can't plane shift away? I thought this would be appropriate since we're on an interplanar theme today. Plane shift, of course, is a powerful 7th level spell which will transport you and up to 8 other willing creatures to a location on any plane of existence. And at higher levels, it's the go-to way if you're looking to get to Arcadia or Ysgard or something like that, rather than trying to find a portal or find someone who can transport you to the realm that you are seeking. Being able to plane shift directly is the popular way to go at higher levels. But there are some restrictions to it. First of all, and most notably, is it requires a specific tuning fork to cast. It's a specific rod which is tuned to the vibration of a particular plane of existence. So you would use a different one for Ysgard than you would use for Arcadia. There would be one for each different planar location that you could possibly travel to. You couldn't just get one and then transport to any plane of existence you wished via that tuning fork. You have to have a specific one tuned to where you want to go. Also, it is a magical effect, so it is vulnerable to things like anti-magic fields, like counter spells, various effects which eliminate you from being able to cast a spell in a location or affect the spell in a different way. And so what would you do if you couldn't plane shift away? Say you were on a location, say you were on the aforementioned quest to find a particular hero in Ysgard, and you've tracked him down to a specific location, and you've gotten what you need to, and then you go to teleport away, and then you can't. Whether you had your tuning fork stolen, or whether or not you are in a particular location that for whatever reason has some sort of anti-magical effect and you were able to walk into the location but you can't teleport away, what would you do? And that could be an interesting little quick plot hook to add some extra and unexpected suspense whenever a party was expecting a quick in and out. Maybe they thought they were just going to go into this location, get what they needed, and teleport away, but now all of a sudden you've created a situation where you can send them on a dungeon crawl or send them through some areas which perhaps they had avoided intentionally before, and now they have no choice because they just can't get their plane shift spell away. It can add a real sense of mystery and propel you into a whole entire session that's completely unexpected, and depending on where you're at, say you're at somewhere really nefarious like Gehenna or Pandemonium or something like that, now all of a sudden you have to deal with these effects that the plane has on you, the optional rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide, if you happen to be wanting to use those, or one that you come up with on your own. These effects begin to mount on your party. You begin to take levels of exhaustion, or you begin to, be affected in some other way as you're trying to figure out how to actually leave this place. It can create a sense of a ticking time bomb in that regard. I really like plot hooks like this, which completely shift the direction that a party thinks the session is going to go. The party could have ended the last session that they had by defeating this person or finding this artifact or what have you, and now they're coming into this next section on the heels of this triumphant thing, and they're ready to plane shift away and now utilize what they have obtained, and now they can't. And now all of a sudden they're being attacked or they're being affected by something, and now they have to figure this out. And it can really throw a wrench into their plans and be a great twist to the particular narrative that you're telling. And hey, they might figure it out really quickly. It could just be something really small, something just about the room that they're in. And it's essentially just a one-room puzzle setup where they have to figure out what's affecting them. They figure it out after 30 minutes in game, and they're off and going. Many different ways you could do this, but it is a nice little plot hook just to add some variety, especially at higher levels where there's such powerful spells like plane shift, which just affect the way that your world works so drastically, with the fact that now they can just travel wherever they want if they've got a tuning fork that works for them. So it can really add some nice, unexpected variety to any given session. But with that, I think we're just about done with this week's episode of Plot Hooks. Thanks everyone out there for listening, and thanks from all of us here at Plot Hooks. I'm Samuel. Thanks also from Matt, Mike, Steve, Dave, Zach, Becca, and of course, podcast pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.